years. To have acquired the capacity for objectivity and reason is half the road to achieving the art of loving, but it must be acquired with regard to everybody with whom one comes in contact. If someone would want to reserve his objectivity for the loved person, and think he can dispense with it in his relationship to the rest of the world, he will soon discover that he fails both here and there. The ability to love depends on one's capacity to emerge from narcissism, and from the incestuous fixation to mother and clan. It depends on our capacity to grow, to develop a productive orientation in our relationship toward the world and ourselves. This process of emergence, of birth, of waking up, requires one quality as a necessary condition: faith. The practice of the art of loving requires the practice of faith. What is faith? Is faith necessarily a matter of belief in God, or in religious doctrines? Is faith by necessity in contrast to, or divorced from, reason and rational thinking? Even to begin to understand the problem of faith, one must differentiate between rational and irrational faith. By irrational faith I understand the belief, in a person or an idea, which is based on one's submission to irrational authority. In contrast, rational faith is a conviction which is rooted in one's own experience of thought or feeling. Rational faith is not primarily belief in something, but the quality of certainty and firmness which our convictions have. Faith is a character trait pervading the whole personality, rather than a specific belief. Rational faith is rooted in productive intellectual and emotional activity. In rational thinking, in which faith is supposed to have no place, rational faith is an important component. How does the scientist, for instance, arrive at a new discovery? Does he start with making experiment after experiment, gathering fact after fact, without having a vision of what he expects to find? Rarely has a truly important discovery in any field been made in this way. Nor have people arrived at important conclusions when they were merely chasing a fantasy. The process of creative thinking in any field of human endeavor often starts with what may be called a rational vision, itself a result of considerable previous study, reflective thinking, and observation. When the scientist succeeds in gathering enough data, or in working out a mathematical formulation to make his original vision highly plausible, he may be said to have arrived at a tentative hypothesis. A careful analysis of the hypothesis in order to discern its implications, and the amassing of data which support it, lead to a more adequate hypothesis and eventually perhaps to its inclusion in a wide-ranging theory. The history of science is replete with instances of faith in reason and visions of truth. Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton were all imbued with an unshakable faith in reason. For this Bruno was burned at the stake and Spinoza suffered excommunication. At every step from the conception of a rational vision to the formulation of a theory, faith is necessary. Faith in the vision as a rationally valid aim to pursue, faith in the hypothesis as a likely and plausible proposition, and faith in the final theory, at least until a general consensus about its validity has been reached. This faith is rooted in one's own experience, in the confidence in one's power of thought, observation, and judgment. While irrational faith is the acceptance of something as true only because an authority or the majority say so, rational faith is rooted in an independent conviction based upon one's own productive observing and thinking, in spite of the majority's opinion. Thought and judgment are not the only realm of experience in which rational faith is manifested. In the sphere of human relations, faith is an indispensable quality of any significant friendship or love. Having faith in another person means to be certain of the reliability and unchangeability of his fundamental attitudes, of the core of his personality, of his love. By this I do not mean that a person may not change his opinions, but that his basic motivations remain the same, that, for instance, his respect for life and human dignity is part of himself, not subject to change. In the same sense we have faith in ourselves. We are aware of the existence of a self, of a core in our personality which is unchangeable and which persists throughout our life in spite of varying circumstances, and regardless of certain changes in opinions and feelings. It is this core which is the reality behind the word I, and on which our conviction of our own identity is based. Unless we have faith in the persistence of ourself, our feeling of identity is threatened and we become dependent on other people whose approval then becomes the basis for our feeling of identity. Only the person who has faith in himself is able to be faithful to others, because only he can be sure that he will be the same at a future time as he is today and, therefore, that he will feel and act as he now expects to. Faith in oneself is a condition of our ability to promise, and since, as Nietzsche said, man can be defined by his capacity to promise, faith is one of the conditions of human existence. What matters in relation to love is the faith in one's own love, in its ability to produce love in others, and in its reliability. Another meaning of having faith in a person refers to the faith we have in the potentialities of others. The most rudimentary form in which this faith exists is the faith which the mother has toward her newborn baby, that it will live, grow, walk, and talk. However, the development of the child in this respect occurs with such regularity that the expectation of it does not seem to require faith. It is different with those potentialities which can fail to develop. The child's potentialities to love, to be happy, to use his reason, and more specific potentialities like artistic gifts. They are the seeds which grow and become manifest if the proper conditions for their development are given, and they can be stifled if they are absent. One of the most important of these conditions is that the significant person in a child's life have faith in these potentialities. The presence of this faith makes the difference between education and manipulation. Education is identical with helping the child realize his potentialities. The opposite of education is manipulation, which is based on the absence of faith in the growth of potentialities and on the conviction that a child will be right only if the adults put into him what is desirable and suppress what seems to be undesirable. There is no need of faith in the robot, since there is no life in it either. The faith in others has its culmination in faith in mankind. In the Western world, this faith was expressed in religious terms in the Judeo-Christian religion, and in secular language it has found its strongest expression in the humanistic political and social ideas of the last 150 years. Like the faith in the child, it is based on the idea that the potentialities of man are such that given the proper conditions he will be capable of building a social order governed by the principles of equality, justice and love. Man has not yet achieved the building of such an order, and therefore the conviction that he can do so requires faith. But like all rational faith, this too is not wishful thinking, but based upon the evidence of the past achievements of the human race and on the inner experience of each individual, on his own experience of reason and love. While irrational faith is rooted in submission to a power which is felt to be overwhelmingly strong, omniscient and omnipotent, and in the abdication of one's own power and strength, rational faith is based upon the opposite experience. We have this faith in a thought because it is the result of our own observation and thinking. We have faith in the potentialities of others, of ourselves, and of mankind because, and only to the degree to which, we have experienced the growth of our own potentialities, the reality of growth in ourselves, the strength of our own power of reason and of love. The basis of rational faith is productiveness. To live by our faith means to live productively. It follows that the belief in power, in the sense of domination, and the use of power are the reverse of faith. To believe in power that exists is identical with disbelief in the growth of potentialities which are as yet unrealized. It is a prediction of the future based solely on the manifest present, but it turns out to be a grave miscalculation, profoundly irrational in its oversight of the human potentialities and human growth. There is no rational faith in power. There is submission to it or, on the part of those who have it, the wish to keep it. While to many power seems to be the most real of all things, the history of man has proved it to be the most unstable of all human achievements. Because of the fact that faith and power are mutually exclusive, all religions and political systems which originally are built on rational faith become corrupt and eventually lose what strength they have, if they rely on power or ally themselves with it. To have faith requires courage, the ability to take a risk, the readiness even to accept pain and disappointment. Whoever insists on safety and security as primary conditions of life cannot have faith. Whoever shuts himself off in a system of defense, where distance and possession are his means of security, makes himself a prisoner. To be loved and to love need courage, the courage to judge certain values as of ultimate concern, and to take the jump and stake everything on these values. This courage is very different from the courage of which that famous braggart Mussolini spoke when he used the slogan, "to live dangerously." His kind of courage is the courage of nihilism. It is rooted in a destructive attitude toward life, in the willingness to throw away life because one is incapable of loving it. The courage of despair is the opposite of the courage of love, just as the faith in power is the opposite of the faith in life. Is there anything to be practiced about faith and courage? Indeed, faith can be practiced at every moment. It takes faith to bring up a child. It takes faith to fall asleep. It takes faith to begin any work. But we all are accustomed to having this kind of faith. Whoever does not have it suffers from over-anxiety about his child, or from insomnia, or from the inability to do any kind of productive work. Or he is suspicious, restrained from being close to anybody, or hypochondriacal, or unable to make any long-range plans. To stick to one's judgment about a person even if public opinion or some unforeseen facts seem to invalidate it, to stick to one's convictions even though they are unpopular, all this requires faith and courage. To take the difficulties, setbacks and sorrows of life as a challenge which to overcome makes us stronger, rather than as unjust punishment which should not happen to us, requires faith and courage. The practice of faith and courage begins with the small details of daily life. The first step is to notice where and when one loses faith, to look through the rationalizations which are used to cover up this loss of faith, to recognize where one acts in a cowardly way, and again how one rationalizes it. To recognize how every betrayal of faith weakens one, and how increased weakness leads to new betrayal, and so on, in a vicious circle. Then one will also recognize that while one is consciously afraid of not being loved, the real, though usually unconscious fear is that of loving. To love means to commit oneself without guarantee, to give oneself completely in the hope that our love will produce love in the loved person. Love is an act of faith, and whoever is of little faith is also of little love. Can one say more about the practice of faith? Someone else might. If I were a poet or a preacher, I might try. But since I am not either of these, I cannot even try to say more about the practice of faith, but I'm sure that anyone who is really concerned can learn to have faith as a child learns to walk. One attitude, indispensable for the practice of the art of loving, which thus far has been mentioned only implicitly, should be discussed explicitly since it is basic for the practice of love: activity. I have said before that by activity is not meant doing something, but an inner activity, the productive use of one's powers. Love is an activity. If I love, I am in a constant state of active concern with the loved person, but not only with him or her. For I shall become incapable of relating myself actively to the loved person if I am lazy, if I am not in a constant state of awareness, alertness, activity. Sleep is the only proper situation for inactivity. The state of awakeness is one in which laziness should have no place. The paradoxical situation with a vast number of people today is that they are half asleep when awake, and half awake when asleep, or when they want to sleep. To be fully awake is the condition for not being bored, or being boring, and indeed, not to be bored or boring is one of the main conditions for loving. To be active in thought, feeling, with one's eyes and ears, throughout the day, to avoid inner laziness, be it in the form of being receptive, hoarding, or plain wasting one's time, is an indispensable condition for the practice of the art of loving. It is an illusion to believe that one can separate life in such a way that one is productive in the sphere of love and unproductive in all other spheres. Productiveness does not permit of such a division of labor. The capacity to love demands a state of intensity, awakeness, enhanced vitality, which can only be the result of a productive and active orientation in many other spheres of life. If one is not productive in other spheres, one is not productive in love either. The discussion of the art of loving cannot be restricted to the personal realm of acquiring and developing those characteristics and attitudes which have been described in this chapter. It is inseparably connected with the social realm. If to love means to have a loving attitude toward everybody, if love is a character trait, it must necessarily exist in one's relationship not only with one's family and friends, but toward those with whom one is in contact through one's work, business, profession. There is no division of labor between love for one's own and love for strangers. On the contrary, the condition for the existence of the former is the existence of the latter. To take this insight seriously means indeed a rather drastic change in one's social relations from the customary ones. While a great deal of lip service is paid to the religious ideal of love of one's neighbor, our relations are actually determined, at their best, by the principle of fairness. Fairness meaning not to use fraud and trickery in the exchange of commodities and services and in the exchange of feelings. I give you as much as you give me, in material goods as well as in love, is the prevalent ethical maxim in capitalist society. It may even be said that the development of fairness ethics is the particular ethical contribution of capitalist society. The reasons for this fact lie in the very nature of capitalist society. In pre-capitalist societies, the exchange of goods was determined either by direct force, by tradition, or by personal bonds of love or friendship. In capitalism, the all-determining factor is the exchange on the market. Whether we deal with the commodity market, the labor market, or the market of services, each person exchanges whatever he has to sell for that which he wants to acquire under the conditions of the market, without the use of force or fraud. Fairness ethics lend themselves to confusion with the ethics of the Golden Rule. The maxim, to do unto others as you would like them to do unto you, can be interpreted as meaning, be fair in your exchange with others. But actually, it was formulated originally as a more popular version of the biblical, love thy neighbor as thyself. Indeed, the Jewish Christian norm of brotherly love is entirely different from fairness ethics. It means to love your neighbor, that is, to feel responsible for and one with him, while fairness ethics means not to feel responsible and one, but distant and separate. It means to respect the rights of your neighbor, but not to love him. It is no accident that the Golden Rule has become the most popular religious maxim today. Because it can be interpreted in terms of fairness ethics, it is the one religious maxim which everybody understands and is willing to practice. But the practice of love must begin with recognizing the difference between fairness and love. Here, however, an important question arises. If our whole social and economic organization is based on each one seeking his own advantage, if it is governed by the principle of egotism tempered only by the ethical principle of fairness, how can one do business? How can one act within the framework of existing society and at the same time practice love? Does the latter not imply giving up all one's secular concerns and sharing the life of the poorest? This question has been raised and answered in a radical way by the Christian monks, and by persons like Tolstoy, Albert Schweitzer, and Simone Weil. There are others, who share the opinion of the basic incompatibility between love and normal secular life within our society. They arrive at the result that to speak of love today means only to participate in the general fraud. They claim that only a martyr or a mad person can love in the world of today, hence that all discussion of love is nothing but preaching. This very respectable viewpoint lends itself readily to a rationalization of cynicism. Actually, it is shared implicitly by the average person who feels, I would like to be a good Christian, but I would have to starve if I meant it seriously. This radicalism results in moral nihilism. Both the radical thinkers and the average person are unloving automatons, and the only difference between them is that the latter is not aware of it, while the former knows it and recognizes the historical necessity of this fact. I am of the conviction that the answer of the absolute incompatibility of love and normal life is correct only in an abstract sense. The principle underlying capitalistic society and the principle of love are incompatible. But modern society seen concretely is a complex phenomenon. A salesman of a useless commodity, for instance, cannot function economically without lying. A skilled worker, a chemist, or a physician can. Similarly, a farmer, a worker, a teacher, and many a type of businessman can try to practice love without ceasing to function economically. Even if one recognizes the principle of capitalism as being incompatible with the principle of love, one must admit that capitalism is in itself a complex and constantly changing structure which still permits of a good deal of nonconformity and of personal latitude. In saying this, however, I do not wish to imply that we can expect the present social system to continue indefinitely, and at the same time to hope for the realization of the ideal of love for one's brother. People capable of love, under the present system, are necessarily the exceptions. Love is by necessity a marginal phenomenon in present-day Western society. Not so much because many occupations would not permit of a loving attitude, but because the spirit of a production-centered, commodity-greedy society is such that only the nonconformist can defend himself successfully against it. Those who are seriously concerned with love as the only rational answer to the problem of human existence must, then, arrive at the conclusion that important and radical changes in our social structure are necessary, if love is to become a social and not a highly individualistic, marginal phenomenon. The direction of such changes can, within the scope of this book, only be hinted at. Our society is run by a managerial bureaucracy, by professional politicians. People are motivated by mass suggestion. Their aim is producing more and consuming more, as purposes in themselves. All activities are subordinated to economic goals. Means have become ends. Man is an automaton, well-fed, well-clad, but without any ultimate concern for that which is his peculiarly human quality and function. If man is to be able to love, he must be put in his supreme place. The economic machine must serve him rather than he serves it. He must be enabled to share experience, to share work, rather than, at best, share in profits. Society must be organized in such a way that man's social, loving nature is not separated from his social existence, but becomes one with it. If it is true, as I have tried to show, that love is the only sane and satisfactory answer to the problem of human existence, then any society which excludes, relatively, the development of love, must in the long run perish of its own contradiction with the basic necessities of human nature. Indeed, to speak of love is not preaching, for the simple reason that it means to speak of the ultimate and real need in every human being. That this need has been obscured does not mean that it does not exist. To analyze the nature of love is to discover its general absence today and to criticize the social conditions which are responsible for this absence. To have faith in the possibility of love as a social and not only exceptional individual phenomenon, is a rational faith based on the insight into the very nature of man. Notes. Cf. A more detailed study of sadism and masochism in Ephraim, Escape from Freedom, Reinhardt and Company, New York, 1941. Cf. A detailed discussion of these character orientations in Ephraim, Man for Himself, Reinhardt and Company, New York, 1947, Chap. 3, pp. 54-117. Compare the definition of joy given by Spinoza. Nationalökonomie and Philosophie, 1844, published in Karl Marx, Die Frühschriften, Alfred Kroner Verlag, Stuttgart, 1953, pp. 300-301. My translation, E.F. I. Babel, The Collected Stories, Criterion Book, New York, 1955. The above statement has an important implication for the role of psychology in contemporary Western culture. While the great popularity of psychology certainly indicates an interest in the knowledge of man, it also betrays the fundamental lack of love in human relations today. Psychological knowledge thus becomes a substitute for full knowledge in the act of love, instead of being a step toward it. R. A. Nicholson, Rumi, George Allen and Unwin, Limited, London, 1950, pp. 122-3. Freud himself made a first step in this direction in his later concept of the life and death instincts. His concept of the former, eros, as a principle of synthesis and unification is on an entirely different plane from that of his libido concept. But in spite of the fact that the theory of life and death instincts was accepted by orthodox analysts, this acceptance did not lead to a fundamental revision of the libido concept, especially as far as clinical work is concerned. Cf. Sullivan's description of this development in the Interpersonal Theory of Psychiatry, W. W. Norton and Company, New York, 1953. Simone Weil, Gravity and Grace, G. P. Putnam's Sons, New York, 1952, page 117. The same idea has been expressed by Hermann Cohen in his Religion der Vernunft aus den Quellen des Judentums, 2nd edition, J. Kaufmann Verlag, Frankfurt am Main, 1929, page 168 ff. Paul Tillich, in a review of the Sane Society, in Pastoral Psychology, September, 1955, has suggested that it would be better to drop the ambiguous term, self-love, and to replace it with natural self-affirmation, or paradoxical self-acceptance. Much as I can see the merits of this suggestion, I cannot agree with him in this point. In the term, self-love, the paradoxical element in self-love is contained more clearly. The fact is expressed that love is an attitude which is the same toward all objects, including myself. It must also not be forgotten that the term, self-love, in the sense in which it is used here, has a history. The Bible speaks of self-love when it commands to love thy neighbor as thyself, and Meister Eckhart speaks of self-love in the very same sense. John Calvin, Institutes of the Christian Religion, translated by J. Albaugh, Presbyterian Board of Christian Education, Philadelphia, 1928, Chap. 7, par. 4, page 622. Meister Eckhart, translated by R. B. Blackney, Harper and Brothers, New York, 1941, page 204. This holds true especially for the monotheistic religions of the West. In Indian religions the mother figures retained a good deal of influence, for instance in the goddess Kali. In Buddhism and Taoism the concept of a god, or a goddess, was without essential significance, if not altogether eliminated. Cf. Maimonides, Concept of the Negative Attributes in the Guide for the Perplexed. Aristotle, Metaphysics, Book Gamma, 1005b, 20. Quoted from Aristotle's Metaphysics, newly translated by Richard Hope, Columbia University Press, New York, 1952. Lao Tse, The Tao the King, The Sacred Books of the East, ed. by F. Max Muller, Volume 39, Oxford University Press, London, 1927, page 120. W. Capell, Die Vorsokratiker, Alfred Kroner Verlag, Stuttgart, 1953, page 134. My translation, E.F. H.R. Zimmer, Philosophies of India, Pantheon Books, New York, 1951. Meister Eckhart, translated by R.B. Blackney, Harper & Brothers, New York, 1941, page 114. LBID, page 247. Cf. Also The Negative Theology of Maimonides. Meister Eckhart, Op. Cit. pp. 181-2. Cf. A more detailed discussion of the problem of alienation and of the influence of modern society on the character of man in E. From the Sane Society, Reinhardt and Company, New York, 1955. S. Freud's Civilization and Its Discontents, translated by J. Riviere, The Hogarth Press, Limited, London, 1953, page 69. S. Freud, Gesellschaft Work, London, 1940-52. Volume 10. The only pupil of Freud who never separated from the master, and yet who in the last years of his life changed his views on love, was Sandor Ferenczi. For an excellent discussion on this subject, see The Leaven of Love by Izet de Forest, Harper & Brothers, New York, 1954. H. S. Sullivan, The Interpersonal Theory of Psychiatry, W. W. Norton and Company, New York, 1953, page 246. It must be noted that although Sullivan gives this definition in connection with the strivings of pre-adolescence, he speaks of them as integrating tendencies, coming out during pre-adolescence, which when they are completely developed, we call love, and says that this love in pre-adolescence represents the beginning of something very like full-blown, psychiatrically defined love. Ibid. Page 246. Another definition of love by Sullivan, that love begins when a person feels another person's needs to be as important as his own, is less colored by the marketing aspect than the above formulation. For a picture of the concentration, discipline, patience and concern necessary for the learning of an art, I want to refer the reader to Zen in the Art of Archery, by E. Herigel, Pantheon Books, Inc., New York, 1953. While there is a considerable amount of theory and practice on this point in the Eastern, especially the Indian cultures, similar aims have been followed in recent years also in the West. The most significant, in my opinion, is the school of Gindler, the aim of which is the sensing of one's body. For the understanding of the Gindler method, cf. Also Charlotte Selver's work in her lectures and courses at the New School in New York. The root of the word education is educere, literally, to lead forth, or to bring out something which is potentially present. Cf. Herbert Marcuse's article, The Social Implications of Psychoanalytic Revisionism, Dissent, New York, Summer, 1955. In the Sane Society, Reinhardt and Company, New York, 1955, I have tried to deal with this problem in detail. A biography of Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm, 1900-1980. Was a German-American psychoanalyst, sociologist, and democratic socialist best known for his classic works Escape from Freedom, 1941, and The Art of Loving, 1956, and for his early association with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. He is commonly considered one of the most influential and popular psychoanalysts in America, and his works have sold multi-millions of copies throughout the world in many languages. Fromm was born in Frankfurt am Main, Germany, the only child of Naphtali Fromm, a wine merchant, and Rosa Fromm, née Krause. His parents were devout Orthodox Jews, and Fromm spent much of his youth studying the Talmud. Though he renounced practicing his religion at the age of 26, Fromm's view of the world remained profoundly shaped by Orthodox Judaism and its rejection of assimilation with the mainstream. Fromm's interest in ethics and legal issues led him first to study law at Frankfurt University and, starting in 1919, sociology under Alfred Weber, brother to Max Weber, in Heidelberg. In his 1922 dissertation, Fromm examined the function of Jewish law in 3 diaspora communities. Introduced by his friend, and later wife, Frieda Reichmann, Fromm became interested in the ideas of Sigmund Freud and started to develop his own theories and methods to understand social phenomena in a psychoanalytic way. After completing his psychoanalytic training in 1930, Fromm began his own clinical practice in Berlin. By then he was also working with the Institute for Social Research, affiliated with the University of Frankfurt, where a circle of critical theorists around Max Horkheimer became known as the Frankfurt School. Following the Nazi takeover, Fromm settled in the United States in 1934. Many of his colleagues from the Institute for Social Research had gone into exile in New York City, joining Fromm. He then taught at several American schools and became a U.S. citizen in 1940. In 1941, Escape from Freedom was published and Fromm started lecturing at the New School for Social Research. He was co-founder of the William Alanson White Institute in New York, and in 1944 he married Henny Gerland, a fellow emigre. In 1950 Fromm moved to Mexico City, where the climate would better suit his wife's health problems, and he became a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. Despite the move, Henny died in 1952, and Fromm married Annie Freeman in 1953. Mexican Institute of Psychoanalysis, where he served as director until 1973. Following his retirement, Fromm made Maralto, Switzerland, his permanent home until his death. Fromm published books known for their sociopolitical and social psychoanalytic groundwork. His works include Escape from Freedom, 1941, Man for Himself, 1947, The Sane Society, 1955, The Art of Loving, 1956, The Heart of Man, 1964, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, 1973, and To Have or to Be, 1976. By applying his social psychoanalytic approach to cultural and social phenomena, Fromm analyzed authoritarianism in Hitler's Germany. In the United States, he described the marketing character, which motivates people to fulfill the requirements of the market and results in increased self-alienation. In addition to his merits as a psychoanalyst of society, and as a social scientist, Fromm always stressed the productive powers of man, reason and love. This humanistic attitude pervades his understanding of religion, his vision of the art of living, and his idea of a sane society. With photography becoming popular at the turn of the 20th century, young Fromm's picture was often taken. Fromm and his mother, Rosa Fromm, around 1906. Fromm's childhood home at 27 Liebigstrasse in Frankfurt. 13-year-old Fromm and his father, Naftali Fromm, celebrate Hanukkah. A complete Fromm family picture taken in Germany during Fromm's Wöhlerschule student days. The Association of Zionist Students in the summer of 1919. Fromm is in the first row, third from the left. Fromm and his second wife, Henny Gerland Fromm, in Bennington, Vermont, in 1946, where they lived part-time until Henny's declining health prompted them to move to Mexico. Fromm made it a priority to meditate and to analyze his dreams every day. Here he is meditating in his home in Cuernavaca, CA, 1965. After his wife's passing in 1952, Fromm found love again with Annie Freeman. Here is a message Fromm wrote to Annie during their marriage. A picture of Fromm and his third wife, Annie, at the end of the 1950s in Cuernavaca. They were married for 28 years, until Fromm's death in 1980. Fromm and his students in Chiconahuac, Mexico, where, in the 60s, they planned a socio-psychological field research project. Though Fromm suffered from several heart attacks during his later years, he was able to smile until the end of his life. The photo was taken 2 weeks before he died, in 1980. All rights reserved, including without limitation the right to reproduce this book or any portion thereof in any form or by any means, whether electronic or mechanical, now known or hereinafter invented, without the express written permission of the publisher. First published as Volume 9 of the World Perspectives, planned and edited by Ruth Nanda Anshin, Harper & Row, New York, 1956. Copyright 1956 by Eric Fromm. Cover design by Angela Goddard. ISBN 978-1-4804-0203. This edition published in 2013 by Open Road Integrated Media, Inc. 180 Maiden Lane, New York, New York, 10038. OpenRoadMedia.com. Find a full list of our authors and titles at OpenRoadMedia.com. Follow us at OpenRoad Media.